The Spitfire is undoubtedly one of the most unrecognizable aircraft ever in military aviation history. And in my personal opinion, I would say that the Spitfire F Mark IX is probably the most recognizable and famous of the different Spitfire variants, so that is going to be the one I am covering for now. In this video, I will compare the Spitfire's in-game fighting capability compared to other aircraft at the battle rating, including its historical nemesis, the Bf-109. If you like my videos, subscribe so that you can always see new content, and let's go ahead and get started. As always, my 5 categories I rate fighter aircraft on are turn, climb, speed, acceleration, and energy retention. So let's start off with the Spitfire's specialty trait, the turn. When it comes to turning, I give the Spitfire a score of 4.5 out of 5. The Spitfire F Mark IX is without a doubt amongst the strongest turn fighters of the battle rating 4.3. It sits at a very competitive BR where there are other 4.3 fighters ruling the matchmaker with their own powerhouse planes for each respective nation. For example, you have the US with the XP-50, the Germans with the 109 G2, and that's seen better days, but still, you have Russia with the Yak-3, Japan with the J2M2, and so on. While the best 4.3 in most ways is objectively the J2M2, the other planes still have a lot to offer. The Spitfires go in guns blazing, aggressive turn fighting playstyle, definitely commands some respect when you're actually engaging. If you're not careful, you might end up too slow in the proximity of a Spitfire, and it'll only be a matter of time before it manages to work its way behind you, get its guns on target, and blow you out of the sky. It manages to pull turns with impressively tight radius due to the massive size of its large wings. This comes at the cost of roll rate, but the roll is still sufficient. There is one flap position on the Spitfire, and that is landing. It can only be deployed at extremely low speeds because it is a landing flap, but it can still come in handy for, those low speed stall fights. Due to the overall extraordinary turning capability of the Spitfire, it oftentimes commands too much respect in air combat. This manifests itself as your enemies can oftentimes be super passive against you and will only engage you if you either have your back turned or have a massive altitude differential. If they don't have these massive advantages in the fight, it's not uncommon for them to just run away or camp the airfield. And to wrap it up real quick, I don't generally like to spend too much time on turn rate because it's rarely ever of use in a normal ARB game, but the Spitfire F Mark IX rates exceptionally well, only being beat out by the J2M2 in a rate fight. Next, let's talk about climb. The Spitfire Mark IX climbs exceptionally well, oftentimes being called the Spacefire, due to its tendency to beat all of the other aircraft in a race to space. In a race to 4,000 meters, the Spitfire Mark IX blows most of the competition completely away. Because of this, I'm going to rate this plane a 5 out of 5 in climb. Really, the only planes that will beat you in a race to 4,000 meters include the Bf-109F4, the Bf-109G2, along with some other 109s at different BRs, and some select Japanese planes such as the J2M series and the Ki 44-2s. It is important to note that while 109s are only slightly quicker in a race to altitude than the Spitfire, the aforementioned Japanese fighters blow everything, including the Spitfire and 109, out of the water, being nearly an entire minute faster climb to all altitudes. Because of this, I have the 109 sharing a 5 out of 5 spot with the Spitfire, while the Japanese planes I just mentioned would be a 6 out of 5 on my scale, just to emphasize how broken they truly are. Moving on to speed, the Spitfire is extremely lacking for a 4.3 fighter, topping out at just 519 kilometers an hour in a straight line at sea level. It's going to leave this thing a 1 out of 5 on the scale due to the fact that there's virtually nothing slower in a straight line at 4.3. Remember when I mentioned the outstanding turn rate of this plane sometimes commands too much respect from its opponents, resulting in them oftentimes just running away? This is why that is so problematic. The Spitfire Mark IX is just slow, and there's very little you can do to get around that. Oftentimes when I see somebody treating the Spitfire with too much respect, I just cave and I let them have every advantage possible going into a fight in an attempt to actually prompt them to fight, rather than run from me or camp the airfield. Usually if they're playing in such a passive manner, it's an indication that they're really not that strong in 1v1 dogfights and they don't have much of a grasp on prop air combat. So it usually isn't a huge deal to go into a fight on a disadvantage against these types of players, as the Spitfire is easy to set traps with. This is especially aided by the fact that despite a low straight line speed of 519 km an hour, it can handle high speed dives before ripping, getting in the high 600 to low 700 km an hour before actually redlining. Use this to minimize the speed differential against your opponents. Usually if a plane is lacking in both speed and acceleration, it would just be considered slow, and likewise just not a very good fighter. Thankfully, acceleration is just as important and arguably more so than top speed, and the Spitfire can accelerate above average, so I'm going to give this thing a 3.5 out of 5 for acceleration. The Mark IX's Rolls-Royce Merlin-61 engine produces 1,473 horsepower, which, all things considered, is not bad at all for a 4.3 airframe. Like any prop, your acceleration dramatically drops off the closer you get to your top speed. The Spitfire's top speed of 519 km an hour is aided by consistent and good acceleration all the way through 470 km an hour, and after that it begins to drop off exponentially as you would expect nearing top speed. It is also important to note that like every plane, the Spitfire accelerates much better on WEP, no brainer, but not just because of the raw engine boost, but also this is due to the fact that the radiators are more closed during WEP, and British radiators tend to act damn near as air brakes. A little bit of an exaggeration obviously, but they're pretty bad. So be mindful at any time your radiators are open, you're losing a lot of acceleration performance relative to other nations with open radiators. Now that we've covered the engine and airframe characteristics, we can get a better grasp of energy retention. Usually energy retention can be guessed somewhat accurately by looking at the general turning performance of a plane in addition to its acceleration. A plane that turns extremely well is going to need more engine power than a plane that turns worse in order to keep speed during full maneuvering. The key to energy retention is to find that happy medium between maintaining adequate to good turning performance so that you can actually obtain the required angle of positioning on your target, but also have a good enough engine that supplements the turning ability of the plane so that it doesn't lose all of its speed while maneuvering. A telling sign of a plane with good energy retention, but also can still turn well, can be indicated by how well a plane rates. In other words, how quickly can the plane complete a 300-degree turn repeatedly. Aircraft with good turn rate performance, such as the Spitfire Mark IX with a rate of 23.4 degrees a second, or the Yak 3 with a rate of 22.1 degrees per second, are some of the planes that find that happy medium between energy retention and turn capability. The turning capability of the airframe allows it to maintain a good degrees per second, and the engine power and the energy retention keep it from falling out of the sky while doing so. These are generally going to be some of the more lethal dogfighters in 1v1 dogfights. Because of everything I just said, and I know that was a lot, I give the Spitfire Mark IX a score of 4 out of 5 on energy retention. It is important to note that just because a fighter scores well on energy retention, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an energy fighter per se. Energy retention is just a measure of how well an aircraft holds the energy that it can produce. The problem is that the Spitfire, as we mentioned earlier, is incapable of getting to high speeds on its own engine/airframe. As a result, it usually has a lower energy state than many of the other aircraft on the battlefield, so while it can hold the energy it does have rather well, this can be completely negated by the fact that many opponents will simply just have a lot more energy than you going into the fight, and as such, it isn't as important if their aircraft doesn't retain it as well, since they have a lot more to spare. So when you add up all the categories, my final score for the Spitfire F Mark IX is an 18 out of 25, and if you simplify that, that's a 3.6 out of 5. While strong in many departments, being the slowest plane of the BR is definitely not going to go unnoticed, and I feel like that holds it back just a little bit, well, sometimes a lot of it. Moving into a more subjective side of things, I give the Spitfire F Mark IX a score of 3.5 out of 5 on the fun scale. When you do get to get your hands dirty and do some dogfighting, the Spitfire is good fun. The problem is that all too often your enemies will just refuse to engage you, leading to some rather slow and uninteresting late game situations. That and the fact that this thing's 4.3, which I have a love-hate relationship, solely because if you encounter a J2M2, there's absolutely no category in which you can actually counter it. It's faster, climbs better, accelerates better, rates better, holds energy better, and it can even turn better than you through the use of flaps and speed. So this gives the Spitfire performance score relative to its BR of, again, 3.6 out of 5, or 18 out of 25, and the fun score being added on gives it a 21.5 out of 30. It is above a 3 out of 5, so I do think you will enjoy playing it. I had some fun getting some footage for this thing. I hope you guys found this video entertaining. If you did, be sure to subscribe for more. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you later.